Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to our Water Commissioners meeting of January 27th. Please note that this meeting is televised. So we are going to get right into the meeting. We have a half hour slotted for this. And at the end, if there are questions, please wait to be recognized by the chair. So Connor, take it away.
Sure. So the first item tonight, we typically do this on a select board agenda item, but just due to the scheduling tonight, and also it's actually quite appropriate given who we are introducing. Your first item is an introduction of our new water operations manager, Richard Tierney, who's here with us in the audience. In preparation of the retirement of our current operations manager, Jack Marsh, following 40 years of service to Easton, I'm pleased to introduce our next water operations manager, Richard Tierney. Mr. Tierney brings decades of waterworks experience to Easton, including local and regional water systems, most recently as the superintendent of Plymouth Water, which is one of the larger municipal systems in the area. He's a U.S. Army and Mass Army National Guard veteran, as well as a licensed plumber. I don't know, Richard, if you would like to add anything to that, but I just wanted to formally welcome you to Easton and introduce you to the select board.
I appreciate the opportunity to meet you all. Look forward to helping work with you all in the years ahead. And I'm grateful to be here with Jack to share some of the experiences of what's been going on and trying to get up to speed with everything that's all affecting the water system right now.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. And did they tell you that you have to stay for 40 years also? We look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So the second item on your agenda tonight, or really the second and third, you have a presentation of a water rate study by Ty and Bond from Mr. Mike Schrader, as well as recommended rates and a vote to set those rates for calendar year 2020, 21, and 22. The Water Commission, from time to time, does vote to adjust the water rates in Easton for our customers to support the ongoing operation and maintenance and future capital planning for the water system. The last time this was done, I believe, was about 6 years ago in 2014, in anticipation of significant capital projects coming down the pipe for the Water Division. We commissioned Ty and Bond over last summer to do the necessary rate study, which was provided to you before this weekend, and invited Mike Schrader to come in and give a presentation of that rate study to build to recommending new water rates. So, without anything else to add, I would ask Mike to just walk us through that.
All right, thank you. Just want to set my timer here so I don't lose track. Okay, so like we said, we're talking about water rates tonight, so I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the process that we use.
Just turn the microphone towards you. Thank you so much.
It doesn't amplify.
It won't amplify, but the cable won't pick it up.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm usually pretty loud anyway. So, let's see if I can make this work. So what we're going to talk about is not doing that. How we set rates, what our the overview is, some of our assumptions, cost drivers, your existing pro forma, which is what we use to evaluate the efficacy of your existing rates, the proposed rate structure, and customer impacts. So rate making, if you think why we charge money for water, is it has two components to it. One is to meet your revenue requirements, which is the expenses that you need to operate your water system. And when we talk about that, we're talking about the full cost of service. And define the full cost of service as doing everything you need to do to run your water system the way it should be run, which means there's no vacancies on staff, you're running a full department, and you're doing everything that you need to do. And you also have a active capital improvement program. So like everything, water, the equipment ages, a lot of it was quite old and installed a long time ago, and it requires regular upkeep. So when we talk about why some rates are higher than other rates, a lot of times I find that it's because they can be artificially low if you're not keeping up with your system. And I have to say, I was not surprised when we did the evaluation and did the model that the numbers were tight, that CIP was active. It was exactly what I thought Jack's system would look like from a sort of a nuts and bolts perspective. So you're in good hands. Then the next part of it is to look back and distribute those costs back to the users, right? So it's an enterprise is run as a fee-for-service proposition. So you get something, you give something, and the rates reflect that user's causation on the cost to the system. And we talk about fairness and equity for that. So when we talk about revenue requirements, a little counterintuitive because it really just means expenses. So there's two kinds of expenses. There's operating expenses and capital expenses. Your operating expenses is your labor and benefits, energy and utilities, residual disposal, which applies both to water and wastewater. And then capital, it's your debt service, which is projects that you've done previously, capital improvements that you're going to do in the future or you're contemplating. And then when we look at those, we look at them under either being debt funded in the future, which would be classified as new debt, or reserve funded or sort of pay as you go, which is sort of the old Yankee way of saying we're saving up and doing them that way. So we look at both, and whether we put something as debt or rate really is just a function of the magnitude of the expense. So our overview is we develop a financial model, estimate the future revenue requirements, and the operating was based on your budgets. Capital is based on the town's capital improvement program. And then we look at your future revenues. So like everything else, it's your cost versus your income. And we look to see, how that looks. So when we look at future revenues, we don't actually project revenues because this is water, and water, most of your income or your revenue comes from people using water. And that changes, right? So that's been going down for a number of years. People are becoming more efficient, smaller families, that kind of thing. So we look back on the 5 years of data and see what has water use been doing in the town, and then we project, or we calculate, I should say, the revenue using your rate structure, which is the combination of fees and charges that are used to develop the bills for each customer. So there's a number of fixed charges, which is based on your water meter size, and then there's the tiered usage rates. So you combine those together and you get a water bill. So that's what we use to project what we think the revenue is going to be in the future. And then based on the expenses and we have the revenues, we just do the math and subtract the two and see, are you potentially running in a deficit in the future? And from there, we look at, with the existing rate structure, which means that setup of fees and charges, we just apply wholesale percentage increases to each year necessary to generate enough revenue, not only to meet the revenue requirements, but also to provide for an operating reserve to give you financial stability. And you'll see when we get to the rates that we don't go up and down with the expenses, but we try to balance it out and smooth out rate increases or rate changes so there's not sudden changes and sort of a shock to the system. So what we do with the pro forma is I'm just going to walk you through the major components of the expenses and talk about how they adjust and why and what drives them. So the first bar is just your operating expenses. That's your labor, equipment, supplies. Goes up roughly 2.5%, give or take, depending on the different items. Next, and what I'm going to do is I show each one independent and then I add it back on because it's hard to see things changing on top of each other. So hopefully it'll make sense in a slide. So we look at your existing debt, which is pretty minimal and starting to decline, and then we put that on top. Oops. So that is your existing debt, your old projects, and then we put that on top of the operating. On top of that is your capital. So the big black bars are the new debt. The biggest black bar is the new water treatment plant. And that's looking at coming online in FY '22, but the debt doesn't hit until the following year. And that's just usually the way it goes. And then on top of that, the red part is the smaller projects that the water department's gonna do out of cash, if you will. So there's a smaller part of that. So when we look at that, we see a big increase coming, and that's what we wanna plan for. So now we put that on top, and we see that's the full pro forma for the expenses. So we see a pretty good increase coming in '23. So now, oh, I'm sorry, this is the capital that generated those black bars and the red bars. On the top, you have the debt funded, which is some water main replacement. Actually, you can see it down here. Some water main replacement, some vehicles, design of the new water plant, equipment. You know, and this represents a good cross-section of the utility. So it means that the town is investing in all the areas, the operational areas of the water system. And what that contributes to is the quality of service. It's dependability, resiliency, you know, dependability, and water quality. So now we add on the revenue from your existing rates at the projected usage, which is pretty much flat. It's going down just a tiny bit. It's pretty stable. So when we look, we see that, you know, starting in FY '20, we're going to be below our, the revenues below the expenses. And when that happens, it's sort of to oversimplify it, it's like a checkbook, right? You can run a deficit as long as you have a balance. And the next thing that we put on here is our balance, and that's the fund reserve. So we can see in FY '20, FY '21, because the expenses outweigh the revenues, it's taking down that reserve and it's spending it down. So as of FY '22, or between '22 and '23, it would basically not, you know, I call it a crash. I don't know what the technical term is, but you run out of money. So what we need to do is adjust that so that we can maintain that those expenses. So what that looks like is a series of increases starting in FY '21 and then going 22, 23, like that. And what these are shown is a rate increase, right? So that 10%, for example, gets applied to every line item in the rate structure that I'm going to show you in a minute. But what's really important to look at is not the number, it's the cost, right? The cost to a family or the cost to typically a residential user. And that's how we're going to look at it. So this is the rate structure that I was telling you about. So each person or each account would pick, you know, would basically pay one of the things on the top between 5/8 and 4-inch, depending on how big their meter is. So a resident would have a 5/8 inch meter, and then they would get charged for that, and then for the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, it depends on how much water you use. So just real quickly, the concept of tiered rates is to encourage conservation. And what it means is you use water, you pay at a certain rate, and once you hit a certain amount, it goes up and it's more expensive per gallon, and it goes up again. It's very common, and it's, like I said, it's protective of your source waters. It helps, you know, maintain some control on usage. And then when we look at the costs, what we're seeing is that with these new rates, that cost on the top is for what we call a low residential user, which is a 4-person household using 50 gallons per day. That's a reasonable, especially like an inside water use what people are using right now. And then on the second side is a higher residential user, and that's 65 gallons per capita per day. And what that is, that's the state's goal for people water use in Massachusetts for residential water use. If you're using above that, they're going to make you work on it and try to get it down. So that's in my opinion, a fair representation. We're looking at the two most likely, or two very likely scenarios for residential users, people in the town. And you can see for the low cost or the low user, those increases are in the range of 45, you know, less than $50 a year, okay? And then for the higher user, makes sense, you spend a little bit, use more water, you pay more. It's on the 50 still under $60 a year. So it could be a little, sometimes it's bad to leave with the percentages because people get agitated when they see numbers like that, but it's the impacts that are really important. The next one we want to look at, everybody wants to look at this, and they want to look at, how do we compare to our neighbors? And again, I do this a lot, and I hate this slide because it's very misleading. You don't know, you could look at another town and say they're so much cheaper, and you find out either A, they don't need to do anything because they have just the cleanest water in the world, or they're not doing anything and they have the oldest pipes in the world. And that could change suddenly. But still, looking at this, the blue bars are from our 2017 rate survey that we do every couple of years. And then the 2021 is where you would be in 2021 compared to everybody else's 2017. And then to be even bolder, I put the 2028 up there compared with everybody's 2017. Now, those other ones are all gonna go, I can't say they're all gonna go up, most of them are gonna go up in that time period too. But, what I would say is, at 2021, you're lower than most. And even at 2028, you're really just catching up with the, sort of the top three there, for what it's worth, right? I mean, what really matters is the cost for your users, and are you doing the right things to maintain a system. The new treatment plant is going to get rid of the brown water, the discolored water. It's going to improve quality. It improves redundancy greatly. It builds in a lot of backup capacity in terms of equipment and stuff. So those are both, those are my two things. And I believe that is my my last slide. So 14 minutes as opposed to 15. So does anyone have any questions? I went through that kind of fast.
Anyone from the board have any questions yet?
I just have a couple to get things going based on what I heard and seen. Whether it's you or one of our people, what is the new treatment plant?
Sure. So when Mike refers to the new treatment plant, that, as you will recall, last summer the board voted to award a pilot contract for engineering the alternatives for a iron and manganese treatment plant, what we call a green sand treatment plant for wells 3, 5, and 7. I'm going to periodically look at Dave, Jack, and Richard. If I'm wrong, 3 people will tell me. The iron and manganese plant is something that's been on our radar for quite some time. It's been in the capital plan for a few years from water, but has been being held off on as we monitored iron and manganese levels. I believe iron and manganese are the materials that lead to brown water and discoloration, things that the Water Division gets some complaints about. I believe some members of the board get complaints about occasionally. And so we've had that on our radar. It's now time to get that incorporated into a rate structure so that we can borrow for and construct that treatment plant for iron and manganese for wells 3, 5, and 7. So that's when we talk about a treatment plant, we're talking about the iron and manganese plant.
And that's not talking about any PFAS treatment?
No, it's not. So but it's a good question. So the cost of that plant, you see it up there, it's $12,090,000 is the opinion of probable cost. That plant, that's higher than our original estimate. 1, because construction costs are just continuing to go up every year, and 2, another factor there is that the plant will be built in a slightly larger building than originally intended to be basically PFAS treatment ready. Those wells are all of our wells are below the current EPA advisory of 70 parts per trillion. You can't close that in public meeting. No problem. All of our wells, all 7 of them are currently and have been below the EPA advisory of 70 parts per trillion. There is a draft maximum contaminant limit proposed by DEP of 20 parts per trillion. Those 3 wells are not at or above that. They have below 20 part per trillion, and I think one of them had 0, or that might have been well 6. Sorry. So they're all below the pending possible regulation from DEP that has not yet been adopted. So nonetheless, just to be proactive, that plant will be sized that if that changes for whatever reason, additional filtration systems can be installed. So that's one piece. As far as PFAS readiness in general, you'll see,
Please leave that door open.
sorry, ma'am, the door needs to remain open.
Thank you.
You'll see the item there, PFAS preparedness study for wells 1, 2, and 4. Those are wells that have, at one point or another, tested above the possible 20 part per trillion threshold. And again, being proactive, that's not a regulation that's on the books right now. But Jack, Dave, and I wanted to make sure that the funding was in place for this year's capital plan. And you'll see up there $110,000 earmarked for that, to do a similar pilot and preparedness study for those wells which did test over the possible draft level, so that we can begin the work of engineering alternatives for treatment for those wells that may need it in the future. If, when we do that, we come to the conclusion that a additional plant on the other side of town would be needed, then we would need to adjust for rates and increase them further for an additional treatment plant.
Okay, Mr. Schrader had referred to that particular chart that showed how we compared to other towns. And I can see part of what's happening there. It's like a moving target for each of the towns. It just shifts back and forth. But is it common, Connor, to have a 5-year window between, what was it, 2014 and doing this kind of study now? 5 years?
Yes, in Easton at least. So we've benefited for for all of time effectively of not having, we don't have any treatment facilities in Easton. Our water is treated, but we don't have any large filtration facilities. So because of our quality of water has been very good, we haven't needed to plan for really large capital projects of this nature. We've always done capital projects for pipes and things like that, but that's really the main change driver here. So it is just time that we build the iron and manganese plant, and we are also preparing ourselves with the engineering study to determine what a possible PFAS plant, if that's what's needed under the regs, would cost as well.
Okay, I'm glad you're explaining it, because it is, to the naked eye, a pretty serious jump for the next 3 or 4 years.
Well, it is on a percentage basis, to Mike's point, but that's why I think it's important to come back to what does that actually look like for folks, and people pay that on a quarterly basis, and we're looking at, in the first year, for a low user about $11 a quarter, and for a high user about $14. I'm not trying to marginalize it, it is an increased cost. However, when you look at where our water costs compare to our peers, we are, I think, second to last by a significant margin, and even with these planned increases, we'll still be in the lower quartile or at the average.
Yeah.
So again, not marginalizing that we don't take lightly any kind of rate increases for anything ever, but particularly with an enterprise account, particularly for a division run as well as Jack's, we feel pretty strongly that these numbers are justified by the pro forma and the capital improvement plan, and that people will get what they pay for.
Thank you.
I do have a couple questions. You said that it was 70 parts per trillion now, right? That's the PFAS.
Oh, that's an EPA advisory.
EPA, yeah.
Yes.
So they came in here in December and they talked to us and they said that by the end of December they were going to lower it to 20.
That the draft rules would be issued, and yes.
But they haven't yet.
Well, the draft rules were issued, I believe, the day after Christmas, and that is the proposed MCL, the maximum contaminant limit.
Okay.
So DPW and I are going to a hearing tomorrow for the proposed rules. Sorry.
That's for groundwater, not drinking water, right?
No, for drinking water.
Right.
So there's multiple things here which cloud the issue a little bit. So there's the mass contingency plan groundwater cleanup that came out in early December, and there was a press release and all that stuff about it. But then shortly after the Christmas holiday, there was a draft drinking water standard issued that, if it goes into effect as proposed, the impact to Easton would be that we would have to do mandatory testing in October of this year, but obviously we're way ahead of that.
Right.
So we're not being compelled to do any of this study right now. We're just trying to stay ahead of it as we have been.
In that same effort, if we know it's going to go down to 20 parts per billion, why wouldn't we engineer this with the PFAS filtering right out of the gate?
We are. Well, multiple
No, we're not.
things.
It's,
One,
the manganese and the,
well, so the iron and manganese,
Yeah,
those
those two.
wells are not over 20 parts per. Those are under the EPA advisory and are under the proposed DEP level.
Okay.
So there would be no.
so those 3 wells, where those come together, that won't be an issue in the future? Or-
Correct, unless it changes.
So,
but based
I'm
on
just trying to conceptualize how things are going to be in the future. So this facility will be for those 3 wells.
Correct.
In the future, another potential facility would be for the other 3 wells that are above 20
20.
parts per trillion. Is that correct? I'm
It
just
could
trying
be
to
one-
piece it together in my head how
It could
this
be
is gonna
multiple
play out.
facilities for the
Okay.
1, 2, and 4 because 3, 5, and 7 have infrastructure in place where those waters can come from those wells and then reach a central treatment plant and be
Right.
distributed. 1, 2, and 4 are not geographically situated in that
Okay.
way, so it may be 2 treatment plants.
Understood.
Yes.
Okay. That answers
So,
my
but
question.
the first step in that is programming, which we have done and will advocate to town meeting, the 110,000-ish number for the engineering study for the possible PFAS plants down the road.
Okay.
But before you could do any kind of construction, you got to engineer and design it. So
Understood.
we'll be doing that.
But I think you bring up a good point. You know, we have to be prepared for what's going to happen, not just for what we know right now, but for what we anticipate over the next 10,
Right, and we've been really
15,
good at
20
that.
years.
I just want to keep that moving. that
We are.
happening.
That's why we're here tonight.
Yep.
And I think this is a good opportunity that maybe we could do some type of education around water conservation, because if, you know, we can control our water bills to a certain extent. I know my water bill is really dropped off now that my kids are out of the house, so they were causing all the high bills. But seriously, if you have people taking 4 showers and now you only have 2 people taking showers, it makes, I didn't realize it would make a significant decrease on that, so. All right, so where is the slide for what the rates are?
Sorry, so it's actually written out for you in your notes I underlined them, second paragraph under item C, recommended rate effective on a calendar year basis. So starting effective January 1st and following years, 2020 at 15%, 21 at 10%, and 22 at 12%. So I would request that the board vote those rates tonight. If after our engineering there's any major changes for future PFAS plants, we would come back and adjust those as needed.
Those are those right there, sir.
Oh, sorry. So you could, if you would like, take a vote to adopt the rates for 2020, 21, and 22 as presented.
Okay, if somebody would like to make a motion to adjust our water rates for the multi-year increase effective on the calendar year basis each January as follows: 2020, 15%, 2021, 10%, and 2022, 12%.
So moved.
Second.
Craig and Mark, all in favor? Unanimous.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We also have minutes to approve or accept, and those are minutes dated November 18th.
And we
Would you like to make a motion?
make a motion to approve.
Chuck and Craig, all in favor? Unanimous. Great, thank you very much. And at this time, I would take a motion to adjourn the Water Commissioners meeting.
So moved. Second?
Craig and Chuck, all in favor? Unanimous. Great, thank you.
You
Thank
too.
you so much, Jack.